Back in the 19th century, there was really no such thing as retirement, simply because almost no one retired. The model American family was an extended one, living on a family farm. When Grandma and Grandpa got too old for hard physical labor, they didn't stop working. They moved from the fields into the home and helped around the house. People worked together, lived together, and took care of one another.
Retirement really wasn't much of an issue because very few people, and we're talking here mostly about men because women were basically homemaker types, very few men lived long enough to retire. The average lifespan at the turn of the century was just something over about 47 years. And the average male spent something a little over a year in retirement. So that was such a minor part of his life that retirement really wasn't an issue.
My father was a coal miner, and he died as a result of being in the mine with black lung. He was a big, strong man. He was 6'4", 240 pounds. He died when he was 44 years old. There was no money put aside for our future, nothing. A retirement's almost unheard of.
But with the dawning of a new century came the birth of the industrial age. The good jobs were found not on farms, but in factories. America was being transformed. But with modern times came modern problems, especially for older Americans.
In the late 19th century, several factors began to change the conditions under which older workers worked and began to change their work lives. One was increasing mechanization. The speed at which these machines had to be operated was a speed beyond which some older workers had difficulty. So this increased pressure on some employers to hire younger persons. Technology and the speed at which technology is operated and these competitive conditions at the turn of the century produce conditions which make it reasonable to begin thinking about getting rid of older workers.
We saw a tremendous shift both in our economic, political, and our social structure. We went really from a three-generation family to almost one and a half, and as you know today it's really a one-generation family. We went from an agrarian economy to really an industrialized economy where some people say people did not do their own work, that they earned money in order to support themselves. So we shifted. We became very mobile. Ford developed the car and people moved around a lot more. There was a lot less of a feeling of obligations to one's parents.
But the shift toward a mobile and industrial society left many older Americans without jobs and without the traditional bonds of kin and community to support them. And due to advances in medicine, they were now living longer. The number of older citizens grew even greater as America became home to hundreds of thousands of elderly immigrants. As their ranks continued to grow, widespread poverty among older Americans became a serious problem, a problem that was being ignored. America was in the midst of a period of unprecedented prosperity. It was called the Roaring Twenties. It was a time of easy money and bathtub gin, and the youth culture of the Jazz Age all but ignored the plight of America's elderly. In 1927, a prominent lawyer observed, quote, "Practically all of the other advanced nations of the world have adopted some modern measure to relieve the suffering of the aged poor. The United States, now the richest nation, stands alone in doing nothing." Suddenly, America's carefree years ended. Banks closed their doors. Industry came to a standstill. 15 million Americans, young and old, were now without jobs and without savings. Unemployment and poverty were suddenly everyone's business.
I'm your pal, buddy, can you spare a dime?
I can still remember it vividly because of the effect on my parents. The sense of hopelessness, of hope lost, in the sense that even though you worked hard through your life and you were honest and upright and thrifty and all these good things, suddenly something could come along and happen in the country at large, which made your efforts worthless.
The Depression hit older Americans especially hard. Most had their life savings wiped out. What few jobs there were went to the young.
In cities like Detroit, Michigan, they were running 45% unemployment. And that created a tremendous political pressure to do something.
In the face of a growing national despair, Franklin Delano Roosevelt promised a New Deal for the American people and was elected president in 1932. At his inauguration, he promised an administration that would remember the forgotten man and embark upon a program of bold and persistent experimentation.
This nation is asking for action, and action now.
Action came quickly. Within days, Roosevelt's administration began to push a flood of New Deal legislation through Congress, providing for widespread public aid. One of the most controversial proposals was the Social Security Act, and contained within it was a small section called Old Age Insurance.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 million of our citizens who will reap direct benefits through unemployment compensation, through old age pensions.
They had a public assistance program which provided for old age assistance, aid to the blind, aid to families with dependent children. There was a rehabilitation program. There was a program for public health. Old age insurance was the last title and was thought really to be a very unimportant part of the program, and it's turned out to be the single largest insurance program in the country.
When Roosevelt in '33 came out with the Social Security, we all said, what the hell is this? They're taking 37 cents out of our paycheck. We were all screaming about this. And it was almost unbelievable, you know.
When Ida Fuller of Ludlow, Vermont, received the very first Social Security check, people soon became believers. She had paid only $100 into the system and was to eventually get $21,000 back. Social Security was indeed revolutionary. Although many complained that it wasn't enough, Social Security profoundly changed America's ideas about growing old. Never again would retirement be synonymous with poverty.
President Hoover promised a car in every garage and a chicken in every pot, but it never materialized until Roosevelt came along. He had our hearts and our soul because he tried to help us.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941,
with the massive industrial buildup required to fight World War II, unemployment virtually disappeared, and concerns about the welfare of the elderly were forgotten as the nation focused its full attention on the war effort.
In every hand, whatever they try, we've got a reply in language that they understand. Arms for the love of America and for the love of every mother's son.
The war was over, the Depression a bitter memory, and people were ready to settle down to the best of what America had to offer. Years of sacrifice had created high expectations for life in post-war America. As revolutionary as Social Security once seemed, now just providing a safety net for people too old to work didn't seem to be enough.
Social Security had really bumped its head against the ceiling. And it's still bumping its head against the ceiling. There are really limits to what you can do with Social Security. After all, most people are paying as much or more in Social Security taxes as they are in income taxes to produce this not terribly significant income level. It's really a poverty income level. If you're going to live in dignity in retirement, you are not going to ever do it on Social Security. You're either going to do it on private pensions plus Social Security plus your savings, or you're just not going to do it.
Since the government's pension plan, Social Security, wasn't enough, workers began to look towards their employers to provide for their retirement through private pension plans. Private pensions were nothing new. The first one in America was established by the American Express Company back in 1875. And the railroads began providing them a short time later. For decades, private pensions were relatively rare. But after World War II, the number of private pension plans grew dramatically. Organized labor's concern for the financial security of retiring workers had led them to push for more and more pension coverage. But it didn't take long for some employers to begin to see the value of a pension plan.
As the idea of private pension plans caught on, employers established them for various reasons. One, it enabled them to have some influence over the turnover of their workforce. They could try to provide incentives for people to work longer or people to retire early as they needed to based upon economic conditions, etc. They also had more of a need to provide private pensions in order to stay competitive with others in their industry, or in order to be able to attract and retain and motivate their workforce.
The feeling clearly exists in the late 1940s that the labor market is something that has to be managed and superintended in a new way. And to do this, one of the ways in which this is done is that workers, older workers, have to be encouraged to leave the workplace. The workplace then becomes a place where younger workers have a priority.
Retirement was becoming a fact of American life. An individual's option to keep on working was being closed off.
In the 1950s, after the rapid growth of pension plans in the late 1940s, there's increasing concern about retirement because more and more workers realize that they are going to be separated from the workplace and they're going to have to spend 10, 15, or 20 years of their lives outside of a work environment. So there's increasing debate and concern in the 1950s about this new thing that's developing, this new lump of leisure called retirement. In response to this concern, insurance companies and other institutions begin to market the idea, a kind of modern idea of retirement. They begin to sell retirement.
Fairy tales can come true. It can happen to you if you're young at heart. For it's hard, you will find, to be narrow of mind if you're young at heart.
Another thing that happens in the 1950s is the proliferation of journals about retirement. Senior Citizen, the magazine, is founded in 1955, and Modern Maturity is founded in 1959. And most of these journals present the new concept of retirement to their readers. They encourage readers to think about retirement as something that's very positive, to prepare for it enough so it presumably will be positive. They've really given up on the world of work as an option for people over 65 or over 70.
Americans embraced the new image of the golden years. Private pension plans were growing at an incredible rate, and millions of retirees were coming to depend on them.
But to say that they grew after World War II is not to say that they were secure after World War II, because until 1974, this promise, I'll give you a pension when you retire, could be made lawfully as a completely breakable promise. You could make it, and then you could walk away from it, and you weren't liable for anything.
They were hollow promises. Promise you 50% of salary when you retire, but if we don't have the money in the fund or the company goes bankrupt, or for whatever reason they decide to terminate the plan, the employee got nothing.
In 1964, one event focused national attention on the tragedy of those broken promises.
There was a car named the Studebaker.
There's a revelation in car performance waiting for you. So drive the new Studebaker for the motoring thrill of your life. To own the new Studebaker is to also experience new
And
comfort.
the Studebaker car was made in South Bend. And Studebaker just stopped making it, or at least they stopped making it in the United States. They didn't go broke, they didn't go bankrupt, they just stopped making the Studebaker. In those days, if you went to South Bend, this is what you saw. You saw a nice little town, and it had basically three things in it. It had Studebaker, it had Bendix, and it had Notre Dame. And when Studebaker shut down, it was an economic catastrophe for South Bend.
And unfortunately, what happened is when Studebaker-Packard went out of business, it liquidated, the pension plan assets were not set aside in a separate trust fund, and there were not minimum requirements to assure that the corporation was setting aside an adequate enough money in order to pay people their pension promises. So as a result, when Studebaker-Packard went under, individuals only got a few cents on every dollar of pension benefits that they had expected to receive.
Included in the unemployed were some 3,000 people over 50 years of age who had about 2,000 dependents under 19 years old. Most of them had no source of income except...
And what we discovered was that the interesting thing about people who are old, who have been done dirt, is that they're all alone. They're isolated out there and they know there's something wrong. They counted on this and it didn't come and they don't know why. They don't know who to complain to. And Studebaker, my client at the time, didn't do anything unlawful. It simply hadn't made a recourse promise. It hadn't made a promise that it had to keep. It settled for a little money. And there was a political explosion.
Frank Cummings went from being a lawyer defending Studebaker to working for Senator Jacob Javits on Capitol Hill, lobbying for regulation of private pension plans. In Senate hearings, thousands of retirees revealed the hardships they had experienced. But the debate dragged on for over a decade. A complicated compromise between labor and business was finally signed into law on Labor Day 1974. The new bill was dubbed the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, Erisa for short. This massive collection of rules and regulations safeguarded private pension plans, forcing employers to stand by their promises.
This legislation will alleviate the fears and the anxiety of people who are on the production lines or in the mines or elsewhere, in that they now know that their investment in private pension funds will be better protected. They have a vested right. They're certain, obviously, of better management of those funds. It certainly will give to those 30-plus million American workers a greater degree of certainty as they face retirement in the future.
Before ERISA was passed, a vast majority of all pension plans in the country did not have enough assets to pay their promised benefits. In fact, less than 40% did in 1975. Today, over 80% of all pension plans have more than enough money to pay all the benefits that they had promised, and a number of them are significantly overfunded, if you will. So just on that one measure alone, there has been a great degree of increase in the security that people have with regard to their pension promises.